There is a tooth in a museum in Lima that is longer than your forearm. 36 centimeters of enamel and dentine, thick as a wrist, worn flat along one edge the way a knife is worn down by years of cutting. It did not belong to a shark. It did not belong to a dinosaur. It belonged to a whale, a sperm whale, and for more than a century, biology told us that sperm whales do not bite. They suck soft squid out of the deep dark and swallow it whole. This tooth says otherwise. It says that once, off the coast of what is now Peru, there swam an animal the size of a modern sperm whale, with the mouth of a predator that ate other whales. Tonight we put that animal back together from a single broken skull. How it was found in the middle of a desert, how it killed the largest shark in history that shared its sea, why it vanished, and why its teeth keep turning up on 4 continents. If the ancient ocean fascinates you, take a second to like and subscribe. Now take a breath. We are going back 9 million years. Start with the strangest part. The deadliest sea predator we are going to talk about tonight was found in a desert. Not near a desert. In one, about 35 kilometers southwest of the city of Ica, in southern Peru, there is a stretch of coastal desert so dry that some places there may go years without measurable rain. The wind moves the sand, nothing grows, and lying in that sand, bleaching under the sun, are the bones of whales, hundreds of them. This place is called the Pisco Formation, and the reason it is full of whales is that it used to be the seafloor. Millions of years ago, this was a shallow, cold, fantastically productive ocean, the kind of water that today, off this same coast, feeds one of the richest fisheries on Earth. Animals lived there in enormous numbers, and when they died, their bodies sank into fine sediment and were buried fast, before scavengers and currents could scatter them. Then the Andes rose, the sea pulled back, and the old ocean floor was lifted into the air and dried into rock. And try, for a moment, to feel how far back 9 million years actually is, because the number slides by too easily. 9 million years ago, there were no humans. Not even close. Our earliest upright ancestors were still millions of years from walking the African savanna. The Andes were lower, the continents sat in slightly different places. The Isthmus of Panama had not yet closed to join the Americas. Whole oceans circulated differently. When Leviathan hunted off this coast, the world was recognizably Earth, and yet not our Earth at all, a planet running an earlier draft of itself, with its own cast of giants. Everything we are about to reconstruct happened in a sea that vanished before our species existed to witness it, and the only reason we know any of it is that a sliver of that sea floor was lifted into a desert and slowly, patiently uncovered by fog and wind. Deep time is the real ocean here. The whale is just the thing we found floating in it. It is worth pausing on how good that preservation is, because it is what makes the whole story possible. The Pisco beds are what paleontologists call a lagerstätte, a deposit so rich and so finely preserved that it captures things that almost never survive. Not just bones, but the shapes of soft anatomy, sometimes baleen, sometimes whole articulated skeletons lying exactly as the animal came to rest. The sediment is fine and chemically gentle, the burial was fast, and the climate that later took over a coastal fog desert, fed by sea mist rather than rain, kept the rock dry and slowly peeled it back without smashing what was inside. What the fog and the wind do now is strip that rock away a few grains at a time, until something that died in the water comes back into the light, on land, in a place where it has not rained properly in living memory. Locals and scientists alike have a name for it. They call it the whale graveyard. In November of 2008, an international team was working that graveyard. Among them was Klaas Post, a researcher from the Natural History Museum in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. It was the final day of the field trip. The trucks were nearly loaded, the season nearly over, and on that last day, walking across an outcrop, Post looked down and saw something he almost stepped past, fragments of bone and the curve of huge, partly exposed teeth, lying upside down and broken in the sediment. He had no idea yet what he was looking at. He just knew the teeth were too big, far too big. Think about the timing for a moment, because field paleontology runs on it. One more day and the team would have been gone. One more season of wind and the exposed bone might have eroded to nothing, or a flash of rain in a freak year might have washed it apart. The single most important fossil in the entire story of macroraptorial whales was found in the last hours of the last day, by chance, by a man looking down at the right patch of desert. The history of paleontology is full of these margins. It is humbling how much of what we know about deep time hangs on someone's eye, catching a shape in the rock before it was gone. What the team had found was a partial skull, about 3 meters long, roughly 75% complete, along with the lower jaw and a set of those enormous teeth. It was carefully excavated, crated, and taken to Lima, to the Natural History Museum of the National University of San Marcos, where it became Specimen Museum 1676. And as the preparators slowly cleaned the rock away from the bone, a painstaking job that took the better part of 2 years, the team began to understand that they were not looking at just another fossil whale. The scientific work was led by Olivier Lambert and Giovanni Bianucci, with Christian de Muison, Rodolfo Salas Gismondi, Mario Urbina, and Gela Roma, and what they were reconstructing was a sperm whale built like nothing alive today. In June of 2010, they announced it to the world in the journal Nature. The paper had a blunt, almost menacing title: The Giant Bite of a New Raptorial Sperm Whale from the Miocene Epoch of Peru, and they gave the animal a name worthy of it. They called it Leviathan, after the biblical sea monster Leviathan Melville, the species name a tribute to Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, the novel about a sperm whale that destroys the men who hunt it. It was, frankly, a perfect name. It lasted about 2 months. Here is the small, very human problem. In the rules of scientific naming, you cannot reuse a genus name that has already been formally given to another animal, and the name Leviathan had been used back in 1841 for, of all things, a mastodon, a relative of the elephant. The whale's name was, in the language of taxonomy, preoccupied, so in August of 2010 the same authors fixed it. They kept the meaning and reached back to the original Hebrew form of the monster's name. Leviathan became Livyatan, Livyatan melvilli, Melville's Leviathan, and that is the name it carries now. There was one more correction to come, and it matters because it tells you how science actually works by revising itself. The first fossils were initially dated to roughly 13 to 12 million years ago. Later work on the rock layers at the site pushed that younger to somewhere around 9.9 to 8.9 million years ago, in the part of the Miocene called the Tortonian. The animal did not change. Our reading of when it lived did. That is not a weakness in the science. That is the science doing its job. And Livyatan was not the only treasure in that one hillside. The exact spot where the skull was found, an outcrop called Cerro Colorado, turns out to be one of the most important single fossil localities in the world for understanding ancient whales. The very same rocks produced the type specimens of other new species announced around the same time: a long-snouted beaked whale called Messapicetus, and a sea turtle, Pacificheles, named for Mario Urbina, one of the fossil hunters on the team. In other words, the desert did not just hand us a monster, it handed us a whole working ocean, frozen in stone. The predator, its prey, its competitors, its neighbours, all preserved in the same few meters of rock, all from a sea that has been gone for nearly 9 million years. That is the rarest thing in paleontology. We almost never get the animal. We even more rarely get the world it lived in. Cerro Colorado gives us both at once, and that is why a single broken skull from a Peruvian desert was able to tell us so much. So that is the discovery. A desert that used to be a sea, a graveyard full of whales, the last day of a field trip, and a skull lying upside down in the sand that turned out to belong to one of the largest predators that has ever lived. But the skull, as impressive as it is, was not the thing that stopped the scientists cold. It was the teeth. Imagine a mouth so wrong for a sperm whale that it forced biologists to throw out what they thought a sperm whale was. To understand why the teeth mattered, you have to understand what a sperm whale is supposed to be. The animal we call the sperm whale today, Physeter macrocephalus, the one from Moby Dick, is the largest toothed predator alive. A big male can reach 16 meters, sometimes more than 20. It has the largest brain of any animal that has ever existed, and it has teeth, dozens of them, in the lower jaw. But here is the strange thing biologists have known for a long time. The modern sperm whale barely uses those teeth to eat. It does not chase down and bite large prey. It dives, sometimes to 1,000 or 2,000 meters and beyond, into cold black water. And it hunts squid, including giant and colossal squid, which it seizes and essentially swallows by suction. Scientists have examined sperm whales whose lower jaws were badly deformed or broken, whose teeth were worn to stumps or never erupted at all, and found them perfectly well fed. The teeth are nearly irrelevant to feeding. The sperm whale is, for all its size, a specialist sucker of soft deep-sea prey, a gentle giant by the standards of predators. Now look at Leviathan's mouth. The teeth of the holotype measure up to 36.2 centimeters long. That is the largest biting tooth of any animal known. If you set aside tusks, and tusks do not count, because tusks are not used to bite, they are longer than the teeth of Tyrannosaurus rex. Let that sit for a second. A whale with teeth that outsize the teeth of the most famous land predator in history. And they are not thin, slicing blades like a shark's. They are thick, deeply rooted cones, built to resist breaking in some related specimens. The diameter at the base is on the order of 8 or 9 centimeters. The width of a fist. The lower jaw held about 22 of them. The upper jaw held about 18. And that detailed teeth in the upper jaw is the first crack in the textbook, because the modern sperm whale's upper jaw is essentially toothless in any functional sense. Leviathan had functional, enamel-coated teeth in both jaws, top and bottom. That is the signature of an animal that bites and holds, not one that suctions. The second crack is what those teeth did to each other. When the scientists examined the ware, they found that the upper and lower teeth had sheared past one another. As the jaw closed, the kind of wear faceting you get, not from grinding plants or crushing shellfish, but from a precise, powerful scissor bite. This is an animal that could close its jaws on something large and cut a piece out of it. The teeth could also interlock, and they were set deep into the gums, which is exactly the arrangement you need to keep hold of prey that is fighting to get away. Grip first, then cut, then grip again. It is hard to overstate how alien this is for a sperm whale, so it helps to picture it directly. In the original Nature paper, the scientists illustrated one of Leviathan's lower teeth beside the tooth of a modern sperm whale and the tooth of a killer whale, for scale. The killer whale's tooth, the tooth of one of the ocean's most effective living predators, looks almost dainty next to it. The modern sperm whale's tooth, slender and peg-like, looks like it belongs to a different kind of creature entirely. And then there is Leviathan's, a broad, banana-curved spike longer than a man's forearm, set into a jaw with 20 more just like it. Imagine 40 of those, top and bottom, closing on a struggling whale. This is not the dentition of a filter feeder or a squid sucker. It is the dentition of the largest active hunter the order of whales ever produced. Then there is the architecture that drove the jaws, and this is where the bite gets genuinely frightening, but frightening in a way the bone can justify, not the way a horror movie can. On the sides of the skull there is a deep depression called the temporal fossa. That is the socket where the temporal muscle anchors the big muscle that slams the jaw shut. Clench your own jaw and feel your temple bulge. That is your temporal muscle, in miniature. In Leviathan that space is enormous, and there is a wide gap between the temporal fossae and the cheekbones, all of it room for muscle. The snout itself is robust, thick, and relatively short. A short, heavily built snout is a bite force snout. It is a crowbar, not a chopstick. It trades reach for the ability to clamp down and hold a thrashing animal without snapping under the load. Now, the obvious question is, how hard could it bite? And here is where I want to be honest with you, because this is exactly the kind of number people love to invent. Lambert and his colleagues did not stamp a single tidy bite force figure on the animal, and you should be suspicious of anyone who hands you a precise one, because we are talking about a creature known from one skull, with no jaw-closing muscles preserved, only the spaces where they used to attach. What the researchers said is more careful, and I think more striking than any made-up number, that Leviathan may have had one of the most powerful bites of any tetrapod, any four-limbed animal that has ever lived, land or sea, reptile or mammal, stronger, by that reasoning, than a T-Rex, stronger than any crocodile. The most powerful bite in the history of four-limbed life may have belonged to a whale. There is one more thing the teeth carry, and it is the kind of detail that makes paleontology feel almost like forensics. A tooth is not a solid lump. It is built up in layers, dentine on the inside, a sheath of cementum on the outside, and in whales and dolphins those layers are laid down in growth bands, a bit like the rings of a tree. Cut a tooth across, and you can, in principle, read a record of the animal's life, how fast it grew, how old it was, the rhythm of good years and lean years. The teeth attributed to Leviathan and its relatives, when they have been broken or sectioned, show those thick layers of cementum and dentine plainly, and the thickness of those layers is one of the things researchers compare when they ask whether a giant isolated tooth from somewhere else in the world really belongs to this kind of animal. A single tooth, in the right hands, is not just a weapon, it is a logbook. And the logbook of this one says, large, slow-growing, long-lived, and built to last under enormous force. Put it together and the contradiction is complete. Same body length as a modern sperm whale, roughly the same kind of skull basin on top, but where the living animal is a deep-diving, squid-swallowing giant that almost never uses its teeth, Livyatan was carrying the dental and muscular equipment of a hyperpredator. The model said sperm whale meant gentle deep-sea suction feeder. The fossil said, not always, not here, not this one, and that single, sheared, oversized tooth in a case in lemur quietly rewrote a chapter of what we thought we understood about the most famous family of whales on Earth. A mouth like that is not built for squid, it is built for meat that fights back. The question, the one the Nature paper was really asking with that word raptorial, is what an animal this size was using those teeth on. And the answer is the thing that earns Livyatan its reputation. Imagine being a 15-meter whale and not being anywhere near the top of the food chain. Livyatan was not a one-off freak. It was the largest and most extreme member of a whole group of extinct whales that paleontologists call the macroraptorial sperm whales raptorial, meaning they seized and tore living prey, the way a hawk does. The group includes smaller, older relatives with names like Brygmophyseter, found in Japan, Acrophyseter from Peru, and Zygophyseter from Italy. They share a family signature, deeply rooted, robust teeth in both jaws, powerful bites, skulls built for hunting rather than suction. These were the wolves of the Miocene Ocean, in a range of sizes. Livyatan is the giant at the end of that lineage, the apex form of an entire predatory experiment in whale evolution, the largest gamble the sperm whale body ever made on biting big things. So what does a 15 to 17 meter raptorial sperm whale eat? Not plankton, not squid, most likely. The size and the shearing wear of the teeth point in one direction: other marine mammals. The leading interpretation is that Livyatan hunted medium-sized baleen whales, animals in the range of 4 to 10 meters, the smaller filter-feeding whales of its time, along with seals, dolphins, porpoises, and probably anything else of the right size that it could catch. Think about what that actually means at scale. The baleen whales of the Miocene were not minnows. Many belong to a now extinct group called Cetiothers compact, fast filter feeders, but still animals the size of a small boat. And Livyatan ate them. We have a predator that treated a several-ton whale the way a killer whale today treats a seal. Zoom in close, and you can picture the mechanics. The grip of 40 interlocking teeth, the shearing close of the jaws, a chunk of blubber and muscle the size of a person taken in a single bite. Zoom back out, and you have an apex predator imposing itself on an entire community of whales. That is a level of carnivory we simply do not have in the ocean anymore. It is worth sitting with that family for a moment, because it changes how you should think about sperm whales entirely. When most people picture a sperm whale, they picture the gentle modern animal, the deep diver, the squid swallower, the philosopher with the giant brain. But for much of the history of this group, that is not what a sperm whale was. Through the Miocene, the seas held a whole radiation of sperm whales that were active, biting predators. Acrophyseter was a relatively small one, a few meters long, but with the same robust, hunting jaws. Zygophyseter, from Italy, was larger, a fast predator sometimes nicknamed in popular writing the killer sperm whale. Brygmophyseter, from Japan, was bigger still. These animals were not anomalies. They were a successful, widespread way of being a sperm whale. The strange one, the exception, is the survivor. The modern Physeter, with its near-useless teeth and its gentle deep dives, is the oddball that gave up the hunt. So when we look at Livyatan, we are not looking at a sperm whale that went wrong. We are looking at the sperm whale taken to its logical, terrifying extreme, the biting predator scaled up to the size of the largest toothed animals alive. The gentle giant is the detour. Livyatan was closer to the main road, and the prey base that supported all of them was unlike anything in today's ocean. The Miocene was a golden age of whales, more kinds of baleen whale, in more sizes than the seas hold now. That diversity is exactly what an apex predator needs. Not one prey species, but a whole spectrum of them, from porpoise-sized to bus-sized. So there is always something the right size to hunt. Livyatan sat at the top of that spectrum, and it could afford to specialize in large, dangerous prey precisely because there was so much of it. Take a moment to feel the scale of that. An ocean so full of whales that it could support a predator whose chosen food was other whales. we have nothing like it left. The way it likely did this is one of the most useful comparisons in the whole story, because we have a living animal that behaves a lot like the reconstruction, the killer whale, the orca. An orca is a toothed whale that hunts other marine mammals, seals, sea lions, dolphins, even large whales using speed, intelligence, coordination, and a gripping, tearing bite. Orcas drown big whales by exhausting them, by working in teams, by separating a calf from its mother. Leviathan's skull, with its mouthful of interlocking teeth and its huge jaw muscles, reads much more like a scaled-up orca than like a modern sperm whale. 3 times the size of an orca, give or take. And that has led to one of the most repeated ideas about it, that Leviathan, like orcas, may have hunted in groups. Coordinated pods of 15-meter predators working together to bring down whales as large as themselves or larger. I want to be honest about that idea, because it is the kind of claim that hardens into fact the more often you hear it. Pack hunting in Leviathan is an inference, not an observation. We have one skull. We have no preserved behavior, no trackways, no kill site with several individuals around a single carcass. The orca comparison is reasonable. The anatomy genuinely supports an active hunter of large prey, but it probably hunted in pods. Is a hypothesis drawn from a living analogue, not something the fossil itself can tell us. Keep that line clear in your head, because it is the line between science and storytelling. The teeth are data, the pod is a model. There is also the question of how it found and subdued its prey. And that brings us to the strangest piece of equipment on the whole animal, the thing on top of its head. Because Leviathan, like every sperm whale, had a deep basin carved into the top of its skull. In life, that basin held the spermaceti organ, the great reservoir of oil and wax and connective tissue that gives sperm whales their blunt, boxy foreheads, and the early whalers prized so highly they named the animal after it. In Leviathan, that basin is huge, running almost the full length of the snout and walled in by high ridges of bone. And here the science genuinely splits into competing explanations, which is exactly where it gets interesting. The first idea is the straightforward one: echolocation. Toothed whales generate sound in their foreheads and listen to the echoes, and the spermaceti complex is bound up in that machinery. So one camp says Leviathan used its forehead the way modern toothed whales do to scan the water with sound, to find and track prey in murky water, to hunt actively and adapt in real time, locating and following a target rather than blundering into it. That fits a predator that needs to pinpoint large mobile animals and run them down. The second idea pushes further, and it is the one that gives Leviathan its monstrous reputation. Several researchers have suggested the spermaceti organ may have worked as a battering ram, a solid mass of oil and tissue the size of a small car, driven by a 15-meter body, could be used to stun or injure prey on impact, or to fight rival males of its own kind, and we know male sperm whales today have larger spermaceti organs than females, which is the kind of pattern you see when a structure is used in male versus male competition. There is also a real-world precedent that makes this less far-fetched than it sounds. The modern sperm whale, gentle as its feeding is, has on rare occasions rammed and sunk ships with its head. In 1820, a whale rammed and destroyed the American whale ship Essex in the Pacific, the event that helped inspire Moby Dick. So the head of a sperm whale can deliver a ship-breaking blow. Now imagine that organ in an animal that was actually built to use it as a weapon. And there is a third, softer version of the same theme, that the sound it produced was loud enough to stun or disorient prey. A kind of acoustic shock. Underpinning all of these is a simple ecological argument. Leviathan lived before sperm whales took up deep diving for squid, in seas absolutely packed with prey near the surface. It did not need its forehead for the deep diving function we sometimes assign to that organ. It may well have repurposed it for something more aggressive. There is a clue in the bone itself that keeps this debate alive. The basin on top of Leviathan's skull is not identical to the one on a modern sperm whale. It runs almost the entire length of the snout, and it is framed by high, thick walls of bone, a deep, reinforced trough rather than a shallow dish that overhangs the eyes. That is the kind of structure you might expect either side of the argument to seize on. Reinforced enough, some say, to have anchored and protected a forehead used in violent impacts. Expansive enough, others say, simply to have housed a very large and very capable sound-producing organ. The same bone supports both readings. That is the frustrating, fascinating heart of working with fossils. The evidence is real and physical and right there in the case in Lima. And it still does not settle the question on its own. So which is it, sonar, signal, or weapon? The honest answer from the people closest to the fossil is that we cannot yet say for certain, and that it may have been more than one of these at once. We do not have the soft tissue. We have the shape of the basin in the bone and a set of educated comparisons to living relatives. Either that great forehead was primarily a sensory instrument, or it was primarily a weapon, and the difference matters enormously to how we picture the animal, and we do not have the data to close the case. What is not in doubt is this. In its sea, Leviathan was not the prey. It was the thing the prey watched for, the shape that resolved out of the blue water too late. And yet, in those same waters, it was not the only ruler. Cruising the same coast, hunting the same fat whales, was a predator that has become a legend in its own right, a shark the size of a school bus. Imagine the two of them in the same square kilometre of Miocene water. When the nature team described Leviathan in 2010, they pointed out something that has launched 1,000 thumbnails since. It shared its ocean with Megalodon. This is not loose speculation about the broad era. In the very same Pisco beds, in the same region, paleontologists find the teeth of the giant shark known to science as Otodus megalodon, or in older usage, Carcharochles megalodon. Megalodon teeth up to around 15 centimeters are relatively common in the area where Leviathan was found. The largest shark that ever lived and the largest raptorial sperm whale that ever lived occupied the same coastal sea off South America, at the same time, eating as best we can tell the same kind of food, the abundant medium-sized whales of the Miocene. That is the setup that makes people lean in. Two apex predators, comparable in length, Megalodon is usually estimated somewhere in the range of 15 to 18 meters or more, Leviathan at 13.5 to 17.5, sharing a hunting ground and a prey base. The original researchers raised exactly this point, that as two top predators competing for a similar food source, Leviathan and Megalodon together probably had a profound effect on the structuring of the entire marine community around them. They were both enormous pressures bearing down on the same web of life. Where they hunted, the whole ecosystem was shaped by the fact that something could eat the whales. And of course, the question everyone wants answered is the one I am now going to refuse to answer cleanly, because the science refuses to. Did they fight? And who would win? Here is what we can actually say. There is, at present, no fossil evidence of a direct, documented encounter between Leviathan and Megalodon, no Leviathan bone bearing a Megalodon bite that we can pin down, no shark tooth lodged in a Leviathan skull. The image of the two of them locked in combat, jaws wide, is reconstruction and imagination. It is art, not evidence. What we genuinely have is co-occurrence. They lived in the same place, at the same time, and they wanted the same meals. That alone is remarkable, but it is not a fight scene. We can compare their weapons though, and the contrast is real and genuinely instructive. Megalodon's teeth were broad, flat, serrated blades slicing tools, designed to take out enormous chunks with a single catastrophic bite and let the prey bleed out. A shark's strategy is often hit, wound, withdraw, and wait. Leviathan's teeth were the opposite design philosophy. Thick cones built not to slice and release, but to grip, hold, and apply sustained, crushing force to an animal that is thrashing for its life. One is a blade, the other is a vice. Beyond the teeth, Leviathan brought something a shark never could. It was a mammal warm-blooded, with the large brain and very likely the complex social behavior of a toothed whale. If it did hunt in coordinated groups, then numbers and strategy, not just size, were on its side. It is worth being just as honest about Megalodon as we are being about Leviathan, because Megalodon has its own version of the single skull problem. We do not have a complete Megalodon skeleton either. Sharks are built mostly of cartilage, which almost never fossilizes, so what Megalodon mainly leaves behind is teeth, some of them up to about 18 centimeters along the slant, and occasionally fossilized vertebrae. Almost everything you have ever heard about how big Megalodon was comes from scaling those teeth and vertebrae against living sharks, usually the great white. That is a reasonable method, but it is a method, not a measurement. And the estimates have shifted as the math has been refined, which is why you will see figures anywhere from roughly 15 meters to 20 meters and beyond, and why serious researchers still argue about the animal's true shape and proportions. So when we say Megalodon and Leviathan were comparable in length, understand that both numbers are reconstructions built on fragment. Two giants, each known mostly from its teeth, each the subject of careful argument about how big it really was. The teeth, at least, are not in doubt broad serrated blades for the shark, thick gripping cones for the whale, and those teeth tell us, more reliably than any length estimate, that these were two completely different kinds of killing machines sharing one sea. But I want to keep us out of the trap here, because this is exactly the kind of matchup that turns real paleontology into a cartoon. The truthful, slightly less satisfying picture is not a gladiator duel. It is a shared ecosystem under pressure from two very different kinds of giant. One, a shark refining a slicing attack it had perfected over millions of years. The other, a whale that had reinvented the entire sperm whale body as a gripping, tearing hunter of its own kind. The most likely reality is that they largely avoided each other, the way large predators that can hurt each other usually do, and competed indirectly for the same prey rather than directly for the same fight. The data says coexistence, not combat. And for a stretch of several million years, this single coast was ruled by both of them at once, a concentration of apex carnivory the oceans have not seen since. It is worth asking why this particular pairing, the whale and the shark, grips people the way it does. Because the answer says something about how we read deep time. We are drawn to the duel because it is a story we understand. Two champions, one winner. But the real lesson of Cerro Colorado is quieter and stranger than a fight. It is that for several million years, this stretch of ocean simply ran two of the largest predators in the history of life at the same time, side by side, on the strength of how much prey the sea could grow. That is not a story about who was stronger. It is a story about how rich a single ecosystem can become before the climate takes the richness away. The giants are not the point. The world that could feed two of them is the point. And then, within a geologically short window, both of these giants disappeared. The largest raptorial sperm whale and the largest shark in history both went silent. That is not a coincidence you can simply wave away. The question is, what happened to the world that had made room for two monsters this size, and why it stopped having room for either of them? To kill something like Leviathan, you do not need a bigger predator. You need to take away its food. Remember why the Pisco Sea was a whale graveyard in the first place. It was spectacularly productive water. Cold, nutrient-rich currents welled up along the coast, the same kind of upwelling that drives the rich Peruvian fishery today. Upwelling brings deep nutrients to the sunlit surface. Nutrients feed plankton feed fish and the filter-feeding baleen whales, and the fat baleen whales feed the top predators. An apex predator the size of Leviathan can only exist where there is a dense, reliable supply of large prey to support it. The animal is a luxury, and the ecosystem pays for it in tons of whale flesh per year. The Miocene seas off Peru could afford that luxury. For a while, the fossil record at the discovery site, a place called Cerro Colorado, backs this up in extraordinary detail. When Giovanni Bianucci and colleagues mapped that single locality, they catalogued more than 300 fossil vertebrate specimens, and the overwhelming majority, around 81%, were cetaceans, baleen whales, beaked whales, dolphins, and the raptorial sperm whales, alongside seals, crocodiles, sea turtles, seabirds, bony fish, and sharks. Read that list again, because it is not just a catalogue, it is a menu. It is the entire support structure that made a predator like Leviathan possible, fossilized in one hillside. The prey, the competitors, and the predator all preserved together. Now take the support structure away. Toward the end of the Miocene, the global climate cooled and ocean circulation shifted. The leading explanation for Leviathan's extinction, and it is, fairly, the consensus framing rather than a single proven event, is that this cooling drove down the diversity, the geographic spread, and the body size of the baleen whales that Leviathan depended on. When your prey thins out, fragments into scattered pockets, and shrinks in average size, an enormous specialist hunter of large whales is exactly the kind of animal that cannot keep its books balanced. The energy stops adding up. The arithmetic of being huge, needing huge amounts of food, turns from an advantage into a death sentence. And the biggest predators, the ones with the highest costs, are usually the first to fall when the base of the pyramid shrinks beneath them. In Peru, Leviathan vanishes from the record around 8 to 9 million years ago. It helps to picture what a cooling event at the end of the Miocene actually means down at the level of the food web, because it is easy to say climate change and let the words slide past. The late Miocene was a time of expanding polar ice and shifting currents, a planet tilting toward the colder, ice-locked world that would eventually become our own. That reorganizes the ocean. Currents move, upwelling zones shift or weaken, The temperature bands where particular plankton and fish and whales can thrive slide toward the equator and break into patches. For a filter-feeding baleen whale, that can mean less food, smaller range, smaller body size, fewer calves, and for the predator sitting on top of those whales, every one of those small reductions compounds. A predator the size of Leviathan is not killed by a single bad year. It is killed by a prey base that, decade after decade, century after century, can no longer reliably deliver enough large animals in one place to keep a 15-meter hunter fed and breeding. The giant does not get eaten. It gets starved out, slowly, by a changing planet. We can even put rough dates on this because of how the rocks themselves are red. The age of the pisco beds is not guessed from the whale. It comes from the layers from microfossils, from the chemistry and magnetism of the sediment, from the position of one bed relative to another. That is exactly how the first 13 million year estimate for Leviathan got revised down to around 9 to 10 million years. Not because the fossil changed, but because the dating of its rock got better. The animal's whole biography when it lived, how long its kind persisted, when it disappears from the record is written as much in the stone around the bones as in the bones themselves. And here is the parallel that makes the whole thing resonate. The part that turns a single extinction into a pattern. Megalodon, Leviathan's neighbour at the top, also went extinct as the Miocene gave way to the Pliocene, and one of the leading explanations is essentially the same story. Cooling seas, shrinking and fragmenting populations of the whales it ate, and, in Megalodon's case, an extra blow. Around 4 million years ago, a new competitor appeared and spread worldwide the great white shark. The paleontologist Robert Boasnecker and colleagues have argued that there was only a short overlap, roughly 3.5 to 4 million years ago, in which the newly evolved great white could spread and outcompete the giant for whatever prey remained. Two completely different animals, a shark and a whale, pushed off the roof of the world by the same changing climate and the same collapsing food supply, within a few million years of each other. The ocean did not produce a more terrifying predator to replace them. It got colder and poorer, and it simply could no longer keep monsters. I have to stop here and say plainly how thin the evidence under all of this actually is, because being honest about that is the whole point. Everything we have said about Leviathan's size, its behaviour, its place in the world, rests almost entirely on a single skull. We have no postcranial skeleton, no vertebrae, no ribs, no flippers, no tail, nothing at all below the head from the original animal. The body length estimates of 13.5 to 17.5 meters are not measured. They are calculated by comparing the width of the skull to the body proportions of modern sperm whales and of the smaller relative Zygophysita, and the high end of that range leans on a relative whose own skeleton is incomplete. The weight figure you sometimes see, around 57 tons, is an estimate stacked on top of that estimate. Even the proportion of the head to the body, somewhere around 17 to 22%, less than in the modern sperm whale, is inferred. We are reconstructing the deadliest predator of its age from a jawful of teeth and a basin of bone. That should not make you trust the science less. If anything, it should make you respect how much careful, disciplined work goes into wringing this much knowledge out of one fossil. But it does mean the picture is provisional, and the people who study it know that. One good skeleton from the Pisco beds could revise the size, the proportions, even the lifestyle. Everything we think we know is balanced on that broken, upside-down skull a researcher very nearly walked past on the last day of a field trip. Imagine how much of this animal is still out there, locked in rock, on coastlines we have barely looked at. Here is the part that turns Leviathan from a single Peruvian curiosity into something much bigger. Since that first skull came out of the desert, the teeth have been turning up around the world. In 2016, in Beaumaris Bay near Melbourne, Australia, a local fossil hunter named Murray Orr found a single giant sperm whale tooth about 30 centimeters long in rocks dated to around 5 million years ago. He donated it to Museums Victoria, and it was nicknamed the Beaumaris sperm whale. It has not been given its own species name, but it looks like a close relative of Leviathan, and crucially, it is millions of years younger than the Peruvian animal, and on the opposite side of the planet. In 2018, paleontologists led by David Piazza reported large sperm whale teeth from Argentina. In 2019, the paleontologist Romala Govinda described a pair of giant teeth from Pliocene rocks near Honderklip Bay in South Africa, again very similar to Leviathan's, again around 5 million years old, and from the open pulp cavities in the teeth, she could even tell that those particular whales were still young when they died. And in 2025, Kristen Watmore and Donald Prothero reported a giant sperm whale tooth from Mission Viejo in Southern California broken, but still at least 25 centimeters long, the first real hint that Leviathan, or animals like it, were not confined to the southern hemisphere at all and may have ranged across the entire globe. Now, the careful scientists do not slap the name Leviathan melvilli onto every one of these teeth, and it is worth understanding why, because it is a small lesson in scientific honesty. A single isolated tooth, however huge, usually is not distinctive enough to nail down to one species. So researchers use what is called open nomenclature. They write things like compares to Leviathan or affinity with Leviathan, rather than claiming a firm identification they cannot support. The reason is simple. A giant tooth on its own leaves open the real possibility that it belonged not to Leviathan itself, but to some undescribed close relative. The honest reading of all these scattered finds is this. Giant raptorial sperm whales, Leviathan, or its near kin, lived in many of the world's oceans for millions of years, very possibly surviving into the Pliocene around 5 million years ago, later than the Peruvian skull alone would tell us. The fossil from Ica is not the whole story. It is the first chapter we happen to dig up, and then there is the cousin that did not die, the animal we started with. The modern sperm whale, Physeter macrocephalus, is the last large survivor of this entire sperm whale radiation, and its survival is the final irony of the story. Because the modern sperm whale solved the very problem that killed Leviathan by going somewhere Leviathan never went, down, into the deep. Instead of competing for shrinking populations of surface whales, the lineage that lived specialized in deep diving and hunting squid in the cold dark a kilometer or two below the surface, in a food supply that surface cooling could not so easily strip away. It kept the great forehead and turned it into one of the most powerful sonar systems in all of nature. Sperm whale clicks are among the loudest sounds any living thing produces, on the order of 230 decibels in the water. It grew the largest brain of any animal that has ever lived, and it let its teeth go quiet until they were almost an afterthought. The mouth that, in Leviathan, was a weapon for tearing whales to pieces became, in its surviving relative, barely a feeding tool at all. It is worth dwelling on just how extreme the survivor's strategy is, because it is its own kind of marvel. The modern sperm whale routinely dives hundreds of meters down, often well past 1,000, and the deepest dives are thought to push beyond 2,000 meters into water so deep and dark and cold that the pressure would crush most submarines. It can hold its breath for the better part of an hour, sometimes longer, on a single lungful taken at the surface. Down there, in total blackness, it hunts by sound, and it finds and seizes squid, including the giant squid and the colossal squid, animals out of legend in their own right. We know these battles happen because sperm whales carry the proof on their skin, rings of circular scars left by the suckers and hooks of squid large enough to fight back. So the lineage that survived did not become gentle in the sense of weak. It became gentle in the sense that it stopped fighting other whales and went to war with the deep, instead trading the daylight surface and the warm-blooded prey for a kingdom of darkness no biting predator had claimed. It kept the head, kept the brain, kept the sound, and pointed all of it downward. That is the branch that made it. Think about what that reversal really says. We tend to imagine evolution as a march toward ever bigger, ever fiercer, ever more dangerous. But the deadliest sperm whale that ever lived is the one that is gone. The branch that survived is the one that stopped biting big things and went hunting in the dark instead, that traded the weapon for the sonar, the surface for the deep, the spectacular for the durable. Herman Melville built his white monster on the gentle survivor, the deep-diving squid hunter we still share the ocean with, and he never knew that the real Leviathan, the one that would actually have earned every line of the legend, had already lived and died millions of years before, off a coast that would one day rise out of the sea and dry into desert. Moby Dick is, in a way, a story about the wrong whale. The right one was already a fossil before there were people to fear it. It is strange and a little wonderful that an animal this important is known mainly from teeth. Think about what those scattered teeth on 4 continents are actually telling us. Each one is a single data point, a dropped weapon from a vanished hunter, and on its own each is nearly mute, the giant cone of dentine with no skull, no jaw, no context. But line them up across the map and across the millions of years, and a shape emerges from the silence. Peru around 9 million years ago, Argentina, then Australia and South Africa around 5 million years ago, then California, a giant raptorial sperm whale, or a family of them, ranging across the world's oceans for a span of time longer than the entire history of our own genus. We assembled that picture not from a body but from the things the body left in other bodies. And it makes you wonder what a single complete skeleton would do to the story. It would give us the real length instead of an estimate. It would show us the flippers, the tail, the shape that moved through the water, whether it was built for the ambush sprint of an orca or the steadier cruise of a great whale. It would tell us, finally, how the deadliest sperm whale that ever lived actually carried itself. We have the teeth. We are still missing the animal. That is where the trail goes cold, and where the honest part of the story lives. We have one skull. We have teeth scattered across 4 continents that whisper there were many of them, for far longer, over a far wider ocean than we first believed. We do not have a single complete skeleton. We do not know for certain how it hunted, whether it truly ran in packs, what that vast forehead was really for, or precisely why the last of them vanished. Only the strong, well-reasoned suspicion that a cooling world simply stopped producing enough large prey to feed a predator that big. Everything we have built, the size, the bite, the behavior, the rivalry with the largest shark in history, we have reasoned out from fragments, with all the care and all the uncertainty that honest science demands. And maybe that is the right note to end on. Off the coast of Peru, the same desert that gave us this animal is still eroding, season after season, the fog rolling in off the cold sea and the wind carrying the rock away grain by grain, exposing new bone every year. Somewhere out there in that desert, or in a Pliocene cliff above an Australian beach, or under a California hillside that got carved up for houses in the 1980s, before anyone thought to look closely at the rock, there is almost certainly more of this creature waiting. A better skull. A real skeleton. The body that would turn our calculated guesses into measured facts and tell us, at last, what the deadliest sperm whale that ever lived truly looked like from nose to tail. The largest raptorial predator the ocean's ever made is not finished surprising us. So far, we have only met its teeth. The rest of it is still down there in the rock, in the dark, in the silence of a sea that dried up 9 million years ago, waiting for someone to walk past on the last day of a field trip and look down.